So today we're going to be talking about another long Caribbean poem. This one with stronger roots in and references to the European poetic tradition than Brathwaite's The Arrivants. Right? The Arrivants is in many ways kind of pushing back more strongly against European colonialism, whereas Omeros aims towards a vision of a more integrated society, right? One in which the various ethnicities that make up the population of a small Caribbean island all more or less find their place. Now, you will note that the title Omeros, right, is Greek for home, the Greek name for the poet Homer, and that many elements of Omeros are clearly modeled on the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the rhyme scheme and certain other aspects of the poem are taken directly from Dante, right? It's written in Dante's preferred measure, terza rima. If you don't know what terza rima is, right? T-E-R-Z-A-R-I-M-A. In a terza rima poem, we have sort of three-line rhyming units. I don't really want to call them stanzas. They're not quite stanzas. But the rhyme something like A, B, A, and then the next will be B, C, B, C, D, C, and so on and so forth, right? So we have these sort of little triplets that are linked together by rhyme, right? It's a sort of chain of three-line rhyming units. So that is the rhyme scheme that Walcott adopts for his poem, Dante's rhyme scheme. Now Dante is using it in the Divine Comedy as a sort of formal allegory for the Holy Trinity. Walcott is putting it to different uses. But first, let's run down who some of the important characters you will meet in the poem will be, because this is a very long poem that covers a very wide geographical and historical scope, and it's often hard to keep straight who's who exactly, right? Unlike The Arrivants, Omeros is a single continuous narrative, right? It's not just sort of a series of voices doing their bit. So one of the first characters you meet is Philoctete. He is an elderly fisherman on the island of St. Lucia with a wounded leg. He is a direct reference to the Greek mythological character Philoctetes, the great bowman, who was abandoned on an island by the Greeks because he wouldn't stop screaming from a snake bite that was festering on his leg. And prophecy held that Troy couldn't be conquered until Philoctetes was cured of his wound and brought back to Troy to finish the war. You might see more familiar Homeric names in Achille and Hector. Achille and Hector are rival fishermen who are both in love with Helen, a beautiful St. Lucian woman who used to work for the white couple that owns the pig farm on the island, Major Plunkett and his wife Maud. Right? Plunkett is a British war veteran. Has, at least at the beginning of the poem, there are references to an unspecified wound. We'll learn what that wound is, or what its effects are anyway, by the end of the poem. He's married to Maud, who is dying of cancer, and is Irish. But he is also in love with Helen. We also have Seven Seas, a blind fisherman and poet. Ma Kilman, who serves as the village wise woman. traditional cures and things of that nature. We will meet at one point Afolabe, a slave taken from Africa, who was renamed Aquile when taken to St. Lucia, who turns out to be the contemporary Aquile's ancestor. This is uncovered in two ways. Aquile is going to take a trip in his imagination when he's lying sort of dying and feverish in his fishing boat back to Africa, and he'll bring back this information with him. And Plunkett is at work on a history of the island of St. Lucia and uncovers some material. Finally, there is a sort of unnamed narrator who is a scholar working in the United States who shares some interests with Plunkett and is probably a kind of analog for Walcott himself. All right, so I want to give you a quick synopsis of the poem as well, because as I said, it can be confusing to figure out exactly what's going on, especially if you're not used to reading narrative verse. So the primary events in Book 1, right, are Hector and Aquile feuding over the love of Helen, and Major Plunkett making the decision to write a history of the island of St. Lucia, which has also at various times been referred to as Helena. Right. Book 2 continues Plunkett's research into French and British wars over the island, and Helen leaves Aquile for Hector, who's making money with his taxi business. Now, Book 3, this is the episode I just talked about a moment ago. It's Omeros' equivalent of Odysseus' journey into Hades. Right? Aquile is out fishing on his boat. He becomes delirious from sunstroke and kind of dreams a journey to Africa, and is then returned to St. Lucia via the Middle Passage, right? Via a slave ship. So he relives in his dreams his own ancestral history. In Book 4, we have the narrator sitting on a college campus in New England, musing on American history and the role of African Americans and Native Americans in it. In Book 5, we're sticking mostly with this narrator as he visits several great international cities. Lisbon, London, Dublin, Istanbul, Venice, Rome, Boston, and Toronto, and then travels imaginatively to the Great Plains, where the narrative voice that takes over is that of a woman named Katherine Wellman, and I'll talk about her in just a minute, just so you have some idea of who the hell she is. Finally, in Book 6, right, Hector crashes his taxi and dies, and Helen returns to Aquile, and Maud Plunkett also dies of the cancer that she's been suffering from the entire poem. Book 7 contains sort of like the most direct references to Dante, right? St. Lucia is re-envisioned, the narrator sort of journeys to hell and then comes out into a paradise. Maud Plunkett is buried and mourned, and it turns out that Helen, who is now living again with Aquile, is pregnant with Hector's child. And there's sort of some indication that this child represents a sort of new hope for the island of St. Lucia, a kind of new synthesis for St. Lucia. Okay, so this is the island of St. Lucia. A little bit about its history. It was originally inhabited by Carib and Arawak Indians. So particularly in Book 1, right, you'll see a lot of references to the Arawak and cultural practices inherited from them. Right. There are no more Arawak. The Arawak are gone. The first Europeans to settle on St. Lucia were 16th century pirates who would hide out here and sort of plan and mount raids from the island. And they were followed in succession by Dutch, French, and English settlers. So St. Lucia has had many different colonial masters. It was colonized by the French in 1660 and taken by the British in 1663. Ownership of the island went back and forth for about 150 years until the British decisively defeated the French in 1814. So as a result of this long conflict, St. Lucia became known as the Helen of the West Indies. Right? The reference being, of course, to Helen of Troy, over whom the Greeks and Trojans spent a decade murdering each other. So the British settlers attempted to enslave the Carib and the Arawak. They proved ill-suited to the training that training, to put it euphemistically, that the British subjected them to, and were vulnerable to European diseases. So most of them died. As a result, the British settlers, still desiring to have a bound labor force, began purchasing slaves in Africa and bringing them in to St. Lucia to replace this native population that the British thought they could make into a labor force. And the slaves they brought in didn't exactly thrive here either because of harsh working conditions and hot weather, not to mention the spread of disease. So the British continually imported slaves until finally the number of Africans on the island vastly outnumbered the number of Europeans. Right? So you had another one of these colonial situations where you have rule by a tiny elite minority. And St. Lucia has been independent from the United Kingdom since 1979. So its independence is fairly recent, like within living memory. I was a year old in 1979, if that gives you some sense. All right, so to talk a little bit about the form of the poem, right, or at least the genre that it fits into generally. I think we've talked a little bit about postmodernism before, but let's just refresh our memories here. Some of the basic premises of postmodern art and postmodern theory are as follows. First, that there is no such thing as universally valid knowledge. All facts are subject to critique, right? That there is no fact or idea that is above analysis, that is beyond question. So, one of the ways this often plays out is in terms of what the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard refers to as the breakup of grand narratives. Now, grand narratives are these sort of broad, sweeping stories that a culture tells itself as a kind of cultural glue, right? For example, the grand narrative of the discovery of the Americas, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and that this then is a kind of originary moment for the development of democratic cultures in the Americas. Now, what a postmodernist would do with this grand narrative is look for holes in it, right? Look for things that don't fit the story that we tell ourselves. Look for places where this doesn't apply to everyone or everything. For example, if we look more closely at the historical record, right? First, Columbus stumbled into his discovery, right? He didn't mean to land in a place that was hitherto unknown to Europeans. He had vastly underestimated the size of the earth because he was an incompetent mathematician. Also, the lands that he stumbled into were already inhabited. And while, from the perspective of European powers, right, okay, we now have this new continent, these two new continents that are opened up for development, settlement, and extracting raw materials. From the point of view of the people who already lived there, this is a disaster, right? So depending on whose perspective you're looking at the grand narrative from, right, it's either new opportunity or it's the end of all we knew, right? So these grand narratives, Lyotard describes as breaking up into smaller or petty narratives that are narrower, that are more subjective, that apply only to individuals or groups, right? That the grand narrative upon closer inspection can never hold up, can never be all things to all people. It can't be the kind of cultural glue that we expect it to be unless we blind ourselves to specific elements of it. A postmodernist would also argue that there is no distinction between high culture and lower popular culture. And in fact, that much of what we today consider high culture, ballet and the opera, for example, the plays of William Shakespeare, is really just the pop culture of a previous era. Now, maybe it held up because it was better than other pop cultural products of the era, right? But certainly, in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, nobody thought that Shakespeare was high art, right? Playwrights didn't publish their plays typically. He was one of the first to do so. So this division between high culture and lower popular culture is regarded by postmodernists as artificial. That there's no reason to make this distinction. A postmodernist would also say that form and style are more important than content, right? How you say it is more important than what you say. There are only a limited number of things that we could possibly say anyway. So the way in which the form we use to express ourselves is really what we ought to be reading and studying, really what we ought to be studying rather than what we're trying to express. Finally, that there's no such thing as originality in art. The same ideas can only be recombined into new forms. And I think we see, particularly in a poem like Omeros, these kinds of forces at work, right? You've got a poem that is trying to combine Greek epic with the Divine Comedy, with the history of slavery and colonization in the Caribbean, right? All of these existing strands using a medieval poetic form sort of as a new means of expressing, like it's working towards a kind of new synthesis of disparate existing strands of thought, right? Rather than creating any kind of, or attempting to create any kind of new strand of thought. if that makes sense. And I hope it does. Okay, so I promised I would tell you who the hell Katherine Wellman was, since she is going to pop up about midway through the poem, right, when the narrator takes his imaginary trip out to the Great Plains. So this is Katherine Wellman. She was a Swiss-born artist and activist who agitated in favor of Native American rights in the late 19th century. She served as private secretary to the famous Sioux chief Sitting Bull and painted 4 portraits of him. In particular, she was close to Sitting Bull when he was heavily involved in the ghost dance movement. We'll talk a little bit more about the ghost dance movement when you actually look at that part of the poem. She was blamed by newspapers at the time for encouraging Sitting Bull's people to revolt because, of course, they couldn't have thought on it on their own, right? They would have needed a white person to prompt them to do it. Leading to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. So she's unfairly blamed for some of the disasters that befell Sitting Bull's people. Now, a little bit about Walcott himself. Right. Don't read too much biography into the poem, but it's good to know a little bit about who we're talking about here. So, Walcott was born in 1930 on St. Lucia, and he is of mixed Dutch and African ancestry. His father was a painter and poet who died before Walcott and his twin brother Roderick were born. And the Walcott family belonged to the Methodist minority on majority Catholic St. Lucia, right? So most St. Lucians are Catholics. There is a small Protestant minority. The Walcotts were part of it. He was trained as a painter. His brother Roderick actually pursued that career path. But when he started reading T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound as a teenager, he decided to switch his focus to poetry. So he's inspired by the difficulty and the elusiveness, right? Allusiveness, as in, full of illusions, of high modernist poetry. So he's been publishing since the age of 14. He published his first poem in a local newspaper and managed to tweak some noses in St. Lucia as a parish priest wrote to the editor to complain that it was blasphemous. And he studied as a scholarship student at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, right? The first real university in the Caribbean. So he didn't have to go, like the members of that Windrush generation did, to England to get a university education. He graduated in 1953 and moved to Trinidad to work as a teacher and a journalist. His plays and poems in the 60s and 70s, he's also a playwright, were really kind of what made his reputation. They are sort of deep and sensitive explorations of the mixed colonial and post-colonial heritages of the West Indies. He was made an OBE, that is sort of inducted into the Order of the British Empire in 1972. This is sort of like, it's not quite as significant as being knighted, but it's sort of on the lower rungs of that ladder, right? And he spent a lot of time working as an academic in New England. He was hired as a lecturer by Boston University in 1981 and founded the Boston Playwrights Theater in the same year. Also is a past recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, so good for you. They just announced the grant winners, I believe, last week for this year. Once again, I was not one of them. And Omeros is relatively recent. It was published in 1990. So this is a mature work by a poet of established reputation, right? This is not the work of a young poet who's still struggling to find his voice. So that's one thing that you really ought to keep in mind as you are reading this, right? That this is a work that has been many, many years in the making and has been very, very carefully thought out and very carefully planned out. I've already told you about the references to Homer and to Dante that you should be looking for. See if you can pick out allusions to other important works as well, because they're in there. This is, like the work of his idols Eliot and Pound, a very, very densely elusive poem. All right, so start digging into Omeros. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll finish up talking about it next week.